Oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess, subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Without objection, Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton of the District of Columbia, Representative Mike Johnson of Louisiana, and Representative Veronica Escobar of Texas are authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearings. In today's hearing. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff as soon as possible. Thank you all for joining us today for the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands legislative hearing on 9 public land bills. I want to extend my gratitude to my colleagues who have sponsored these bills, as well as to today's witnesses for their testimony. Today's hearing is an opportunity to acknowledge a number of different important public lands priorities and legislative bills that I think will inure to the benefit of the people of our country. It also is an opportunity to find new ways to honor diverse communities and in small but significant ways ultimately reconcile issues in our past. First, we will consider H.R. 4009, introduced by Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton, which recognizes the long neglected history of the Georgetown waterfront's involvement in the slave trade. H.R. 4009 commemorates the more than 1,400 people who passed through Georgetown before being sold into slavery, while highlighting the plentiful contributions of Georgetown's African American community. While the horror that these individuals endured is irredeemable, it is essential that we acknowledge this history in an effort to move forward. We'll also hear about the Blackwell School in Marfa, Texas. For more than 50 years, it served as the sole public education institution in the state for children of Mexican descent, with 4,000 students in attendance from 1909 until Marfa schools were integrated in 1965. Although there were no state laws mandating segregation, many Texas schools practiced de facto segregation through the mid-20th century. I'd like to thank the bill's sponsor, Representative Tony Gonzalez, for elevating the important history of the Blackwell School and putting forward this proposal to incorporate its story into the national park system. Our public lands, monuments, and memorials tell the stories of our history, and proposals like those that we are reviewing today are helping to ensure that story represents the rich diversity of our wonderful country. Unfortunately, it bears noting that there are many geographic features and national forests that still require modification. H.R. 4454, introduced by Representative Al Green, would direct the Secretary of the Interior to establish the Advisory Committee on Reconciliation in place names to advise federal agencies with respect to renaming geographic features that may contain offensive names. I also want to commend Representative Green for his leadership. Today, we'll also consider proposals from Representative Kirkpatrick and Escobar that would honor the victims and survivors of 2 horrific mass shootings. As the representative for Boulder, Colorado, I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the destruction and the grief that far too many communities like mine have faced from acts of gun violence. As you all know, my community experienced a devastating tragedy earlier this year. We will forever remember the 10 lives lost on March 22nd of this year in Boulder, as well as the 6 lives lost on January 8th, 2011 in Tucson, Arizona, and the 23 lives lost on August 3rd, 2019 in El Paso, Texas. The horrific shooting that occurred on January 8th in Tucson was the first time in our nation's history that an assassination attempt was made upon a member of Congress while meeting with constituents. Congresswoman Gabrielle Gifford suffered severe injuries that continue to affect her to this day, and among the lives lost was the first congressional staffer to be assassinated in the line of duty. H.R. 2050, introduced by Representative Ann Kirkpatrick, would designate Tucson's January 8th memorial as a national memorial, paying tribute to the victims while highlighting the resiliency of our democracy. We'll also consider H.R. 4380, introduced by Representative Veronica Escobar, which would designate the El Paso Community Healing Garden as a national memorial. This tragedy represents the largest targeted attack against Latinos in modern American history, and it serves as a glaring reminder that too often the safety of our communities has been compromised simply because the color of one's skin. I want to thank my colleagues for their efforts in honoring the victims, survivors, and families of these tragic events. I certainly look forward to learning more from the bill sponsors and witnesses here today about these bills and other critical public land measures. And with that, I'd like to yield the balance of my time and recognize Ranking Member Fulcher for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Maguse. Today, we need to discuss the merits of 9 National Park Service-related bills that are predominantly focused on preserving historic locations from our nation's past to help us better tell the unique and diverse stories that make up the fabric of America. The first one I'd like to highlight is the Save the Liberty Theater Act, sponsored by Representative Mike Johnson of Louisiana. This bill gives full ownership of the Liberty Theater to the city of Eunice, a common sense consolidation that will save taxpayer money and enable the city to pursue important renovations and improvements for this historic theater. Next, I'd like to commend another Representative Johnson proposal, the Cane River Creole National Historical Park Boundary Modification Act, that facilitates a locally supported effort that will unify the property and simplify the management of the historical park. Finally, I'm pleased to see Representative Gonzalez's bill to designate the Blackwell School in Marfa, Texas, as a National Historic Site. The Blackwell School in Marfa, Texas, served as the sole public education institution for the city's Mexican and Mexican-American children from 1909 to 1965. This is a fitting bill to consider during historic Hispanic Heritage Month, and I applaud the gentleman from Texas for his leadership on this issue. The common thread for each of these bills is that they are local in nature, have widespread support, and would either simplify management or save taxpayers money. Regrettably, not all the bills before us today meet those standards. Specifically, the Reconciliation in Places Names Act is a divisive, duplicative, and unnecessary virtue-signaling bill that creates an unaccountable new layer of federal bureaucracy rewrite history under the guise of addressing so-called offensive place names. Certain sites are in need of name changes and should be and will be changed to the existing U.S. Board on Geographic Names process. It's therefore perplexing that my friends on the other side of the aisle offered this bill, which is both unnecessary and overly broad. The language in this bill will give a new board of unelected bureaucrats virtually unlimited power to rename sites they now deem as offensive. Where will we draw the line? Will they seek to rename the Washington Monument? What about an area that was designated by Congress for a specific name? These are all examples of unaccountable overreach that will be made possible under the bill as written. Put simply, this bill will only create more divisive conflict around this issue while doing little, nothing to actually expedite name change. I thank the witnesses for appearing here today. Look forward to your testimony and the ensuing discussions that will follow. With that, I go back to balance my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fulcher. Now I'd like to turn to our first panel and welcome the members of Congress who wish to testify on the bills that they have sponsored. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use Stack View so that they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. The chair will now recognize, I believe Mr. Green is not with us. If so, he can clarify. But not hearing him, the chair now recognizes the distinguished gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Chairman Maguse, for holding this hearing on 2 of my bills. The women who worked on the home front World War II Memorial Act would authorize the establishment of a memorial on federal land in the District of Columbia, commemorating the efforts of the 18 million American women who kept the home front running during World War II. Last Congress, the House passed this bill by voice vote. Senators Tammy Duckworth, Mike Braun, and Marsha Blackburn introduced the companion bill in the Senate. It is bipartisan. As a fifth grader, Raya Kenny, who is my constituent and the founder of the nonprofit Women Who Worked on the Home Front Foundation, developed the idea for this memorial. She rightfully questioned why the women on the home front, whose efforts were so instrumental in maintaining the stability of the country during World War II, have not received recognition for their contributions like the men who bravely fought in World War II. The work done by women on the home front during World War II opened doors for women in the workplace more widely and had a profound and lasting effect on the labor market. My second bill, Mr. Chairman, the Georgetown Waterfront Enslaved Voyagers Memorial Act that you spoke of, would authorize the Georgetown African American Historic Landmark Project and Tour to establish a memorial on federal land in DC commemorating the enslaved individuals who are believed to have disembarked at the Georgetown waterfront after forced migration to the United States by way of the transatlantic slave trade. The National Capital Memorial Advisory Commission unanimously supported this bill with a recommendation that the memorial should honor all enslaved people in the United States. I support amending the language of the bill to do so, as does the project sponsor. Enslavers packed 12.5 million captive Americans into their ships, as well as chattel in the as to sell as chattel in the Americas. Enslaved Africans are believed to have first been brought through the Georgetown port in 1732. Though records are incomplete, some scholars believe that between that year in 1761, 7 ships carrying an enslaved 1,475 enslaved people arrived here. Those who survived the traumatic Middle Passage voyage were marched through tunnels and led to the C&O Canal through the sewage system to slave auction blocks on M Street, now Georgetown's main commercial thoroughfare. While the entire contribution of enslaved people in DC cannot be determined, we know with certainty that white citizens and the federal government both relied heavily on enslaved labor to build the nation's capital. We must not hide from this history. This bill provides for the creation of a powerful marker of truth-telling and remembrance. Let us honor the personhood of these individuals who were repeatedly assumed to have none, so that they will never be forgotten. These bills would not only authorize the memorials about critical events in the nation's history, but would also help to diversify the memorials on federal land in the nation's capital. Again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Holmes Norton. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green. Mr. Green, I believe you are muted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for tolerating the technical difficulties that we've suffered this morning. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and all of the members of the subcommittee for considering H.R. 4454, the Reconciliation of Place Names Act. I also thank Secretary Holland for introducing this legislation in the 116th Congress, as well as the 27 endorsing organizations. Additionally, I have to thank my very good friend, Commissioner Rodney Ellis from Harris County, for his decades of support to this cause. Mr. Chairman, minstrel characters and other denigrating portrayals rooted in unfounded disparaging stereotypes have for too long dehumanized minorities and people of color in our country. To define them, they have used these terminologies in the most of embarrassing ways. This is evidenced in multiple facets of American life, from herald household brands to landscape and geography. Derogatory terms such as Negro, Squaw, Chinaman, and Redskin have been included in the geographical names of public places across our nation. These appellations are pernicious relics from the era of invidious discrimination that was yet lawful at the time. During this era, white supremacists imposed pernicious appellations on minorities and people of color as a tool for suppression and subjugation. They dishonor our Constitution while debasing our nation. Last summer, after the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, the zeitgeist of our time became imbued with a racial awakening as its hallmark. Private companies rebranded their decades-old racist caricatures and their logos, as well as other representations of honorosity. The federal government must take up the same just cause by renaming and rebranding any structure or geographic feature with a pernicious appellation that is maintained by tax dollars. Currently, the United States Board on Geographic Names oversees all naming processes and decisions. While the board's policies authorize changing the names of offensive geographic features, the current process is time-consuming, is underfunded, and is ill-equipped to address the vast nature of the problem. The Reconciliation in Place Names Act would specifically do the following. It would create a 17-member advisory board composed of individuals with backgrounds in civil rights and race relations to bring a depth of knowledge and experience to the process. It would solicit proposals from tribal nations, state and local governments, and members of the public, and would provide an opportunity for the public to comment on name change proposals. It would require an advisory board to make recommendations to the board for renaming and to make recommendations to Congress for renaming federal land units with offensive names. Secretary of Interior, the Honorable Deborah Haaland, introduced this legislation in the 116th Congress. I reintroduced it in the 117th Congress. And currently, Senator Elizabeth Warren has introduced a companion legislation in the United States Senate. Finally, Mr. Chairman, if I may say this quickly, I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak on this topic. It is a very sensitive topic, and I trust that the members of this Congress will see that this is an opportunity for us to correct an injustice that we've had to endure for too long. I believe it can be done. The way to do it is with us. We but only have to have the will, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Green. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, if he is here. I don't believe Mr. Gonzalez is with us, so we will proceed to hear from the gentleman from Louisiana. And my apologies, Mr. Johnson, for not mentioning your important bill as well, which we're certainly eager to consider today also. So the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee. I'm happy to have two bills on the docket for this important hearing. The first is H.R. 3197. That's the Save the Liberty Theater Act. The Liberty Theater is located in my district in beautiful Eunice, Louisiana, and it's been a staple of Louisiana's Cajun community for nearly a century. It's hosted famed Cajun musicians and served as an important center of culture and tourism, not only for the local community, but for all of South Louisiana. For years, the theater worked hand in hand with the neighboring Prairie Acadian Cultural Center that's operated by the National Park Service. Through this partnership, the Park Service and the city of Eunice were able to organize and carry out various cultural events that showcase the unique Louisiana heritage that so many people worldwide cherish and embrace. Because the Park Service and the Liberty Theater facilities share the same city block, Each assumed certain maintenance and upkeep responsibilities that were mutually beneficial. Unfortunately, because of funding constraints, this shared responsibility was unable to continue, and a memorandum of understanding between the two parties was terminated. There's still an opportunity for the Park Service and the theater to collaborate on various events, but they simply no longer share in the upkeep and maintenance responsibilities of the two facilities. And the cost of upkeep for Liberty Theater is considerable. The building is also in need of some extensive renovations and restoration. A group of local stakeholders has begun outreach to raise the funds necessary to bring the theater back to its former glory, but a technical problem remains regarding the National Park Service's ownership interest in an annex to the theater that was built to allow disabled individuals to access the facility. The ownership interest of the Park Service has made it somewhat difficult to secure restoration dollars because some believe that that interest brings red tape that would slow that necessary process. My bill remedies this problem by directing the Secretary of the Interior to convey the Park Service's ownership interest of the annex to the City of Eunice. This simple act will give the city full ownership of the theater and the annex so the community can move forward with the restoration efforts. We work closely with the Park Service on this bill, and while they haven't issued a formal statement on their position, they have reviewed the text and they deem it technically sufficient, and they have no suggested edits. We have full community support, and you'll hear from my good friend, the mayor of Eunice, on this issue in a separate panel. This is a straightforward matter that has a simple solution. So I thank you for scheduling it for today's hearing, and I look forward to working with you as the process continues. My second bill on the calendar today is H.R. 4648, the Cane River Creole National Historical Park Boundary Modification Act. As that title indicates, this bill will adjust the boundary of the Cane River Creole National Historic Park in beautiful Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana, to accommodate a historically and culturally significant piece of property and make it part of the historical park. By way of quick background, the park was created in 1994 to commemorate the unique mix of cultures involved in the settlement of Louisiana's Red River Valley. The park consists of two existing units, Oakland Plantation and Magnolia Plantation. Both are National Historic Landmarks and National Bicentennial Farms. They were owned by the same family for over 200 years, and through Park Service programs, they tell the tragic story of slavery and the triumphant story of African American history in the region. Importantly, however, when the land was originally donated to the Park Service in 1997, the donors only included certain outbuildings, and several remaining structures remained in private ownership by the descendants of the original landowners. In August of last year, the family contacted the Park Service about donating that remaining property for incorporation into the park. As I mentioned, this new donation includes culturally and historically significant structures that will enhance the visitor experience and paint a clearer picture of the history of the Red River Valley. The park superintendent has received correspondence from all concerned parties expressing a desire to transfer their interest in the privately held properties to the park. And this proposed transfer has received support from state and local leaders and many organizations that you'll hear about later today. Rebecca Blankenbaker is the executive director of the Cane River National Heritage Area. We work closely with her on this bill, and I'm confident she can further attest to the significant amount of local stakeholder support for this legislation when she appears on a later panel. In closing, I just want to thank the chairman and the ranking member once again for including these two bills in today's hearing, as they're extremely important to my constituents and to our national interest in preserving our history. I'm looking forward to working with you all to advance them both, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Gentleman yields back. Is Mr. Gonzalez with us, Madam Clerk? Not, we will proceed.
Unfortunately.
It looks like Tony just joined the,
Oh.
I think Tony just joined the chat. Or not the chat, but the meeting.
Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. We will go ahead and yield to you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman. I'd like to thank both of you for inviting me to provide opening remarks at today's legislative hearing on my bill, H.R. 4706, to establish the Blackwell School National Historic Site in Marfa, Texas. In fact, In fact, this being my freshman term in Congress, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify to a committee for the very first time. One of the most precious gems in America is our robust assortment of national parks. From east to west coast, Americans are able to experience breathtaking landscapes and relive some of the most monumental events in American history. When we think of our great nation's history, it's paramount that we look outside the traditional parameters. We must identify life and share of forgotten. We must work together in Congress to paint a more accurate picture of how the country came to be. That picture is not complete without including the history of Mexican Americans and their struggle for equality. Segregation is an ugly stain on Americans' legacy. And while we have progressed as a people, we must acknowledge the painful role segregation played in our history. From 1909 until 1965, Blackwell was Marfa's segregated school. Though at the time, law mandated separate schools for African Americans, it was optional for school districts to decide whether or not to segregate Mexican students. Marfa chose to segregate. In July of this year, I joined my good friend, Representative Phil Vela from Texas, in introducing this bipartisan piece of legislation. Additionally, my friend, the senior senator from Texas, Senator John Cornyn, introduced this bill in the Senate with his colleague, Senator Padilla of California. This is not a complex legislation. The Blackwell School Bill aims to do four things: establish the Blackwell School National Historic Site as a unit of the National Park System. By doing so, this will help preserve, protect, and interpret for the benefit of future generations. As you know, the site may not be established until the Marfa School District enters an agreement with the National Park System. They are ready to do so. Lastly, my bill prohibits any private property or non-federal public property from being included within the boundaries of the historic site or managed as part of such site without the written consent of the owner. My district, Texas 23rd Congressional District, is home of 8 of Texas's 16 national parks, Big Bend being the most famous. As I travel across my 29 county district, I have seen firsthand the positive economic, ecological, and social impacts national parks have on the surrounding communities. Establishing the Blackwell School as a center of education and tourism will help bring much needed economic support to Presidio County and the town of Marfa. Though not every story of our past is one to take pride in, there are stories to be told and honored from every chapter in the story of America. Today, I want to thank the committee for taking a step in the right direction in preserving the story of generations of Mexican American school children from Marfa, Texas, by establishing the Blackwell School as a unit of the National Park System. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez, and congratulations on your first testimony on a bill. Undoubtedly more to come. With that, we'll go ahead and transition to the second panel. I also just want to take a moment of personal privilege to recognize something I didn't do at the beginning of the hearing, which is that our chairman of the full committee, Chairman Grijalva, is here, and we appreciate his presence. I serve on 4 committees in the House, which is more than typical. And I can certainly tell you that of all the committees I serve on, I don't think there's a single chairman on any of my committees that ultimately participates in all of the subcommittee hearings, which I know Chairman Grijalva endeavors to do, and we're so grateful for that and for his leadership. So with that, I want to thank the sponsoring members of Congress for their valuable testimony, and now we will transition to our second panel. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it'll turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. The chair now recognizes Mr. Mike Caldwell, Associate Director of Park Planning, Facilities, and Lands at the National Park Service.
Chairman Neguse, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present the Department of the Interior's views on the 9 bills on today's agenda. I would like to submit our full statements for the record and summarize the department's views. HR 149 would designate the Peter J. McGuire Memorial and Peter J. McGuire Memorial Gravesite as the Peter J. McGuire Memorial National Commemorative Site and would authorize the Secretary of the Interior to enter into cooperative agreements. The department recommends deferring action on HR 149, although HR 149 stipulates that the memorial would not be considered a unit of the National Park System. We would recommend a study be conducted to determine whether it meets the criteria for national significance, suitability, and feasibility. HR 250 would direct the Secretary of the Interior to establish the January 8th Memorial as an affiliated area of the National Park System and to develop a general management plan. The department would recommend deferring action on the portions of HR 250 that authorize an affiliated area of the National Park Service or a role for the Secretary of the Interior until a study has been completed. HR 3197 would direct the Secretary of the Interior to convey to the city of Eunice, Louisiana, ownership of the National Park Service constructed annex adjoining the city-owned Liberty Theater. The department supports HR 3197, transferring ownership of the Liberty Theater annex to the city of Eunice would allow the city greater autonomy, provide significant cost savings to the NPS, and clarify management responsibilities. HR 3531 would authorize the Women Who Worked on the Homefront Foundation to establish a commemorative work on federal land in the District of Columbia to commemorate the commitment and service represented by women who worked on the home front during World War II. The department supports the intent of the legislation, but suggests an amendment may be helpful to clarify the focus of the commemorative work. HR 4009 would authorize the Georgetown African American Historic Landmark Project and Tour to establish a commemorative work on federal land in the District of Columbia to commemorate the enslaved individuals who disembarked at Georgetown waterfront after enduring the Middle Passage. The department supports this legislation with amendments. The National Capital Memorial Advisory Commission concluded that the bill's broader themes of addressing the suffering and trauma endured by individuals who were enslaved and brought against their will to this country rises to the level of lasting historical significance to the nation. HR 4380 would designate El Paso Community Healing Garden at El Paso County's Esperade Park as the El Paso Community Healing Garden National Memorial. The department does not have a position on HR 4380, as the memorial would not be located at a site under the jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior and does not provide for any management or funding by the National Park Service. HR 4454 would direct the Secretary of the Interior to establish an advisory committee on reconciliation and place names to advise the board on geographic names about renaming geographic features that currently bear place names that are considered offensive or derogatory. The department supports HR 4454 and welcomes the establishment of place names that are equitable and just, honor the cultural diversity of the United States, and advance dignity for all people in the United States. HR 4648 would expand the legislative boundary of Cane River National Historical Park in Louisiana by approximately 46 acres. The department supports HR 4648 with a technical amendment to update the map reference. HR 4706 would establish Blackwell School National Historic Site as a unit of the National Park System upon meeting certain conditions. The NPS has not had the opportunity to evaluate the Blackwell School as a potential unit of the National Park System. Amending the bill to provide for a special resource study of the Blackwell School rather than the establishment of a new unit would enable the NPS to better understand this story in the national context and gather information on management needs of the site. Chairman Neguse, this concludes my statement. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, for your important testimony. And I want to remind the members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D, imposes a 5-minute limit on questions, and the chair We'll now recognize members for any questions that they may wish to ask the witness. I have no questions, so why don't I yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes if he has any questions for Mr. Caldwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Caldwell, I mentioned in my opening statement that HR 4454 gives the new unelected board virtually unlimited power to rename sites across the country that they deem. And so, for the record, does the administration believe that the Washington Monument should be renamed? Or what about the Jefferson Memorial or the Lincoln Memorial?
This is a important and complex issue we continue to evaluate. And as I stated in our testimony, the department supports HR 4454, and especially the public process that would be established by this legislation. No decisions or anything of the sort have been made by the department about any place name.
So you are open to changing those names?
I think we support the 4454 and the public process that would be part of looking at place names.
In those cases,
We are very supportive of equitable and just and names that honor the cultural diversity of the U.S. and advance dignity for all people of the United States, as I did in the testimony.
those cases, that is a clear rewrite of this. It's a shame that you're even considering such a thing. Does the administration believe that sites named by an act of Congress should be overturned by an unelected?
Mr. Fulcher, if I just may interrupt you, I'll let the time continue, but if you could just talk a little louder or turn the volume up, I think we're having a little difficulty hearing you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully this is better. I'll speak a little closer. Mr. Caldwell, does the administration believe that sites named by an act of Congress can or should be overturned by an unelected board of bureaucrats?
The names of NPS units are determined by legislation, or in the case of national monuments, by presidential proclamation.
And should those be able to be overturned by an unelected board?
I think those are names that are provided statutorily.
Okay, Mr. Caldwell, as we discuss offensive places and names, two of these sites are undoubtedly the Muir Woods National Monument and John Muir National Historical Site, which is named after John Muir, the founder of the environmental group, the Sierra Club, and also an avowed racist. In fact, according to the Sierra Club themselves, and I quote, as the most iconic figure in Sierra Club history, Muir's words and actions carry an especially heavy weight. They continue to hurt and alienate indigenous people and people of color who come into contact with the Sierra Club. My question is this: does the administration support changing the name of Muir Woods John Muir National Historic Site, particularly in light of his repudiation of the very group that he founded?
The names of NPS units are determined by legislation or presidential proclamation. We understand this is a complex issue and that we don't take lightly, and the department supports the legislation, especially support the public process that's part of the legislation.
Okay, so that's a unique way of sidestepping the question. Would you like to try another attempt at answering it?
I guess once again, all units of the National Park Service receive their name from legislation.
And you support Congress's ability to identify those names and would not try to interfere with a separate board?
I think as we administer units across the system, we take the enabling legislation of each of those units very seriously.
Okay, once again, thank you for sidestepping that question. I wish you would have answered. Mr. Caldwell, one of the bills before us today, the Georgetown Waterfront Enslaved Voyages Memorial Act, would designate the Georgetown waterfront in Washington, D.C. as a memorial in honor of the transatlantic slave trade. This is also a subject of the NPS studies as the history of Georgetown as a slave port is settled. My question is this: can you tell the committee what evidence, if any, NPS has found so far that would help settle the debate on whether Georgetown was really, in fact, a slave port?
I think that right now the NPS has developed a legacies of enslavement and raised community of practice among the units that we have in Washington, D.C. And the idea behind that is to enhance the education and interpretation of the legacy of slavery. If authorized, the memorial will enhance existing programming at CNO and Rock Creek Park, including wayside exhibits, walking tours, story maps, and online educational resources that tell the story. And
way of
historical
saying that you
research,
don't know.
the historical research will continue on that area.
So is that another way of saying that you don't know?
I think it's an important part of the story that we already tell, and we'll continue to try to strengthen the telling of that story.
Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I'll recognize myself. I won't use the full 5 minutes, but just as perhaps a bit of, by way of background and context, I think for the rest of the committee members, this is the second panel. We will have a third panel of witnesses who will testify in support of the various bills that we're considering today. Mr. Caldwell, as you all know, is an administration witness. He is here as part of the second panel to provide technical insights and the administration's position with respect to legislation that we are considering. And so would just encourage folks, obviously, take all the time you need, but I would hope that we would recognize that Mr. Caldwell is here for that unique and limited purpose, and that members will have plenty of opportunities to question the witnesses who were identified in support of these bills on the third panel. With that, I will now recognize Vice Ranking Member Tiffany, if he has any questions. Mr. Tiffany?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffany. The chair will now recognize Chairman Grijalva. If he has any questions.
No. No, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair will now recognize Mr. Gomer. Hearing none, the chair recognizes Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse. Just get my the other. Okay.
Just FYI, Mr. Tonko, we can't we can hear you, but we can't see you. But you may proceed.
Okay. Sorry about that. I think you have my video now, I believe.
Now we can see you. We're all very grateful.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chair. I'm proud to represent the Capital Region of New York, where certainly I have seen the incredible strength and the healing and possibility that comes from commemorating our shared histories and heritage. We're fortunate to have several national heritage areas that instill a strong sense of place in our communities, provide individuals with a place to gather and reflect, and strengthen local economies in the process. And that's why I am so proud to push for legislation such as my National Heritage Areas Act that would ensure that these sites can serve our communities for generations to come. And it is, I think, very important that all communities and identities not only have access to these precious sites, but also see themselves and their stories reflected within them. So, Mr. Caldwell, how is the National Park Service making our parks more inclusive, both in the stories that they tell and the visitors who enjoy them?
Well, thank you, Congressman. Good. Certainly appreciate your role in many of the heritage areas across your part of the state. I think one of the things that we have tried to emphasize, certainly in the recent past, and as identified in our National Park System Plan that was issued in 2017, that the establishment of a national park unit is not the only avenue to increase diversity and representation under the NPS umbrella. And sharing previously untold stories within existing units and programs also provide opportunities to expand the narratives. And as you alluded to and are certainly familiar with, whether they're heritage areas, affiliated areas, national trails, wildlife, wild and scenic rivers, the NPS can leverage its expertise and funding to work with communities in collaboration and do something together that we could not have done individually.
Okay, and I thank you for that. And what are some of the biggest barriers that remain to making our parks reflective of the stories of all Americans and accessible to all Americans?
I think we continue to work at continuing to look at stories through different eyes, different perspectives. Our civic engagement of our superintendents across the country is critically important. As you well know, with your experience in upstate New York, things like the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor don't just happen overnight. They take a lot of interaction. They take a lot of collaboration across many differences of opinion and ideas about our history. And I think that's one of the reasons I think the administration has been supportive at looking at our history in different eyes, through different ways and different histories.
Well, I know that having been involved from a state perspective and now a federal perspective with Heritage Corridor work, the outreach and the efforts for inclusion have been very beneficial because there are several sub-themes or related themes that can be embraced and embellished through the heritage area and Heritage Corridor concept. How would the bills before us today remove some of those barriers?
So I think in the case of, say, the McGuire Memorial, the commemorative site, designation, that's a designation that's relatively new. I think there's 3 across the country, but I think the importance of cooperative agreements, being able to provide that technical assistance to different communities that are affiliated with these sites, I think is one of the critical aspects that could help improve exactly what you're asking me.
Okay, well, I look forward to strengthening that partnership with the agency so that we obviously can do everything to having people feel part of a process that is so significant to not only define the sense of place, but to provide that spirit that built that place. So I thank you. And with that, Chairman Neguse, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lamborn for 5 minutes. Sounds like Mr. Lamborn might not be with us, so the chair will now recognize Ms. Holmes Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, around the world, from Ghana to El Salvador, there are memorials that recognize the legacy of enslaved Africans. They serve as powerful remembrances and even healing. While similar memorials have been established in New York and Alabama, as yet the District of Columbia does not have a memorial that bears witness to the legacy of enslaved people, despite the fact that the federal government relied heavily on enslaved labor to build the nation's capital. My own ancestors were among them. Could you speak to the symbolic importance of having a national memorial located here in the nation's capital that honors the enslaved people who forcibly migrated to the United States by way of the slave trade?
Yes, Congressman, thank you for that question. First, I want to acknowledge certainly the efforts being made with the National Park Service units, their existing staff, existing leadership. I walk by Lafayette Park every day on the way to the department and seeing the recent exhibits, wayside exhibits about the construction of the White House. I think those types of stories need to be told, need to be researched. And I think as we indicated, we would welcome an opportunity to work with you, to work with the community on the Georgetown Waterfront Memorial. I think the other important thing has been, I know, subject of testimony by others from the National Park Service, is the importance of the networks across the national park system, networks related to African American history, for example, the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. I think those are important networks that the National Park Service doesn't necessarily own anything as part of those networks, but we provide interpretive assistance. We provide assistance when it comes to National Historic Landmark nominations, et cetera. And so I think, to your point, the involvement and the incorporation of the important story of Washington, D.C. certainly has a place in that broad network of the stories that you eloquently highlighted in your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. It's my understanding that NPS is currently conducting research into the question of whether slave ships disembarked in Georgetown in particular. The architect Rodney Leon, in connection with the Georgetown African American Historical Landmark Project and Tour, is leading a master's course at Yale University that will study archival records to determine where along the waterfront slave ships may have docked. Will historians at the Park Service consider the findings of the Georgetown Landmark Project and of the architect Rodney Leon as a part of their inquiry?
Yes, I think the engagement with the public and subject matter experts always helps the National Park Service gather information to just better understand those stories related to these sites and the importance of public places in their telling. So absolutely.
Very much appreciate your responses, Mr. Caldwell, and I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rosendale for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. Mr. Caldwell, I read the Department of Interior statement for the record on HR 4454, the Reconciliation in Places Names Act. I've got to say, I wasn't surprised by the department's support of this bill, but I'm extremely frustrated. Since January, House Democrats, along with President Biden, have advocated for a radical, divisive policies steeped in critical race theory. They've weaponized every institution of our federal government to seek out and punish those whom they disagree with. In the military, one of our greatest apolitical institutions in the nation, President Biden has mandated critical race theory trainings to promote extreme left-wing ideologies and indoctrinate enlisted service members, all while they simultaneously purge the ranks of individuals on the other end of the ideological spectrum. In the Department of Justice, the institution responsible for enforcing our nation's laws, officials are now looking at ways to punish and intimidate parents who dare express concerns over school curriculums containing critical race theory at the direction of the Biden administration. In the halls of Congress, the institution that creates these laws, statues of historic figures crucial to the formation of the United States as a nation were removed from the Capitol in an attempt to expunge our nation's history of past sins and send a political message to dissenters of the left's woke ideology. Now, at the Department of the Interior, the institution responsible for maintaining our nation's parks and public lands, departmental leadership endorsed a bill to erase any names of parks, monuments, and public places that are deemed offensive. This would be governed by a board of 17 people, consisting only of 3 representatives from the general public. Make no mistake, this bill is not about equality. Now, this bill is just another attack on every American who loves their country, who stands for the flag, and who's proud to call the United States of America the greatest country on earth. On the 4th of July, I unapologetically waved the red, white, and blue. But President Biden will have you believe that this makes you a racist. You should instead ignore the creation of this great country and celebrate Juneteenth National Independence Day, which he just signed into existence this year. Throughout history, America has been a bastion of democracy and freedom. We've lifted more people out of poverty and oppression than any nation on earth and have asked for nothing in return. Understanding and appreciating this history is vital. As with any country, there are imperfections in our past, but America is still the greatest nation on earth, and our accomplishments are worthy of celebration. The purpose of the National Park Service is to preserve our history, not whitewash it. I'm deeply concerned that H.R. 4454 is yet another attempt to rewrite history through the lens of critical race theory. And while you're in a very uncomfortable position to have to defend it, I'm sorry, you are here to represent the administration. So I have a couple of questions for you. And I'm looking for just some simple yes or no's. Would you rename places currently named after Thomas Jefferson?
The names of sites are established through statute.
Okay, so we're going to go through this exercise again that I saw Representative Fulcher went through. How about, would you rename places or recommend renaming places named after FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
Once again, I think the names of historic sites go through an established democratic process.
This bill is supported by your department and will judge figures of the past by modern standards. I don't believe that it's fair. I believe our founders should be judged holistically. This bill is very clearly tied to the radical left's agenda to enshrine the racial history of this country as the leading aspect of our national story. It seeks to overshadow all the good this country has brought to the world.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Focus on racial sins. America is a great nation, and any efforts to cast her otherwise should be opposed. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you. And let me, real quick, if I may, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Director, the legislation 4554 that, as I understand the tenor of the questioning to you by the minority is the greatest threat being faced by America's identity in the history of this nation. And you mentioned it, and you know, I always find it ironic that when we get to these discussions that other thing, it becomes an ideological one. It is not an ideological one. This discussion and even and the legislation that Mr. Green and others are supporting is about bringing a process into an issue that is controversial, and it's controversial because it's tied to the fact that decisions are not made on real history, and decisions are not made on real facts. And Mr. Caldwell, talk about that process and talk about the need that we have to do that, because you know it's also, you know, telling our history as a nation is an important one. We're a diverse nation, and all that history should be told. We shouldn't erase some of it, and we shouldn't invent any of it, and we shouldn't protect any of it from the reality and the truth. And if they're not consistent with what this country purports to be, we need to deal with it. And we need, and this process and the legislation provides, the Park Service provides this Congress with an opportunity to do that in a pragmatic, fact-based, history-based process with the public involved and not shut out of it. So, Mr. Caldwell, talk about that process and why as you mentioned it twice in your response to questions, it is a critical part of the legislation.
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. I think, as just to reiterate it, as you said, there is a process established in this bill. The department supports that. They support the process, particularly, as you alluded to, the public part of the process. And just reassuring, no decisions have been made. You know, a process is important, as you talked about. And we support this bill. The establishment of place names that are equitable and just, and honor the cultural diversity of the United States, and really advance the dignity for all people of the United States. And using a process where these conversations can happen is a critical piece of this bill.
For too long, Mr. Chairman, and I want to applaud you and your committee members for having this hearing and all the legislation that's on there. You know, from the preservation of Cajun history and culture and music to the acknowledgement of the horrors and the misery of slave trade in this country. That's our story. And when you tell the full and real story, Mr. Chairman, and that's why I applaud you, because this adds to America's story. And all these items on this agenda do. And I want the past and the current lifetime that we're living through events that are shaping our history is defining us as a nation. And I want to thank you for that, because you know, when we tell the real history, it is not about it's not an attack on anybody. I'm not attacking any of my colleagues when I want to tell the history and want to acknowledge the importance, the significance, and the history of a segregated school in Texas, and thank Mr. Gonzalez for that, or to acknowledge the reality of the slave trade. Telling that full history is not attacking an individual. It is not attacking our country. It is telling the history of this nation, blemishes, good looks, warts and all. That's us. And I applaud you for bringing those kinds of items before us and something that the full committee can take action. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chairman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Moore for 5 minutes for any questions.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Caldwell. Got a few actually specific questions to a bill that I was able to do through this committee, the Bear River Heritage Act, and wanted to dig into just a little bit of that, because there's been actually there's been several National Heritage Area Study Acts in this Congress, including the Bear River one that we had done a few months ago. Any advice from you as you see communities going to work on some of these, to study the process to ensure, to ensure that it's done efficiently as possible? Any sort of just general thoughts to those types of bills, not particularly to the Bear River, although you're welcome to discuss that if you know much about it, but just in general, any advice there?
I think and thank you for your question. I think it's important for any community that's engaging with the National Park Service as a way to preserve the nationally significant stories of their area, is to really have that collaboration, the open communication, the dialogue, and to learn from other heritage areas, for example, or other affiliated areas. I think certainly Congressman Tonko has several in upstate New York, and I think to rely on some of the technical advice and experience of Park Service staff who have worked with heritage areas, I think is critically important. I think at the end of the day, the National Park Service is successful as our partnerships are successful. And I think as you venture into whether it's a special resource study or a recon study, those are important efforts of a community interacting with the National Park Service to really look at some important history. What's the history? What's the significance? All those other elements of how this agency can work in collaboration with communities. So bottom line, just learn from the past experiences across the country and try to tap into those experiences that people have had.
They're timely and expensive. I think we could be in agreement on that. How many do you know of? How many do you know how many are currently in process? My question's about backlog, right? Like understanding,
Sure.
why such a big backlog, and just a general sense for how many they are, so I can communicate.
Right now, we have in the pipeline, we have about 25 authorized studies and 8 reconnaissance surveys pending. So that's our backlog. Where our goal, our work plan talks about getting about 7 out to Congress in 21. And I think what I would say in terms of our needs to improve our processes internally, as we identified in our National Park Systems Plan that we issued in 2017, and we could certainly provide you a copy of that. We speak to how do we internally in the National Park Service perhaps expedite our process? What opportunities do we have to, for however you want to put it, speed up the process internally to get to these determinations in perhaps a more efficient way? And so we allude to that in the National Park System Plan. And like I said, happy to follow up with the committee staff and go over some of the things that we're at least considering now internally within our agency to expedite those.
And that's the essence of my question is what can we do to expedite? What can we do to make this a little more timely process? The folks that have been working on the Bear River Heritage Study Act, I mean, it's been years, it's been decades that they've been wanting to do this. I would love to be a part of getting this in the right direction. I oftentimes think that my consulting background that I just left the management consulting world. I would love to find a way to dig in and actually make changes here. So know that our office is very, is very important to us, but we'd be willing to dig in if there's anything we can do to help, untangle some of this, because the backlog will even be more of a disruption and a frustration for my constituents. So yeah, but that's the essence of my question. Largely a big backlog. Got to make it more timely and efficient, and really appreciate you making that a focus. So thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Ledger Fernandez if she has any questions. Hearing none, the chair now recognizes Ms. Escobar if she has any questions. Hearing none. Ms. Escobar?
Hi, Mr. Chairman. No, thank you. No questions. I'm here to introduce my constituent for the next panel.
Oh, terrific. All right. Well, then we will go ahead and proceed to the next panel. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, again for your testimony and for indulging us with your time today. We certainly appreciate it.
Thanks, sir.
We will now transition to the third panel. As with the first two panels, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I'll also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. Before introducing our witnesses, I will remind non-administration witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. The chair will now start by recognizing the Honorable Ron Barber, President of the Board of Directors for Tucson's January 8th Memorial Foundation.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher, and of course, Chairman of the whole committee, Grijalva, my neighbor here in Arizona. My name is Ron Barber. I'm the president of the January 8th Memorial Foundation Board and a former member of the House of Representatives. It's an honor to be with you today to discuss H.R. 250, the January 8th Memorial Foundation Act. On behalf of our board, I want to thank Congresswoman Ann Kirkpatrick for introducing this legislation and all the members of the Arizona delegation for their support. H.R. 250 will designate the January 8th Memorial as an affiliated area of the National Park Service and a national memorial. Due to the significance of the events in Tucson on January 8, 2011, this memorial should become a national memorial. The tragic shooting that day shook our community and our nation. This designation will allow people from all across our country to know that the memorial exists and what it stands for. The construction of the memorial has been completed. It was dedicated on January 8, 2021, the 10th anniversary of the shooting. The memorial is located in El Presidio Park in Tucson, next to the historic Pima County Courthouse, Pima County Government, and Tucson City Hall. Much consideration was given to its placement or its location, and the Memorial Foundation Board approved its placement there because it is the center of civic life in Pima County. On January 8, 2011, Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was holding her 21st Congress on Your Corner outside a supermarket in Tucson. These were informal events where the Congresswoman would meet face-to-face with constituents to hear their concerns. Through Congress on Your Corner events, the Congresswoman brought government closer to the people and made herself accessible to her constituents. Gabby was shot in the head and miraculously survived. I was shot alongside the Congresswoman and would have died had it not been for the fast response of shoppers and EMTs. The memorial honors the 6 people who were killed on that fateful day and those who were wounded and survived. It is also dedicated to the remarkable response from our community in the wake of this unspeakable tragedy. That outpouring of support showed the strength, the resilience, and the true spirit of Southern Arizonans. Our first responders saved many lives that day, and the memorial is dedicated to them as well. Dorothy Dot Morris, Chief Federal Judge John Roll, 9-year-old Christina Taylor Green, Phyllis Schneck, Dorwin Stoddard, and Gabe Zimmerman were the fatal victims of the shooter who came to assassinate Congresswoman Giffords. The memorial includes tributes to each of those who died, as well as 13 others who were wounded. Each person has a unique set of symbols on the interior of the wall and the memorial, and these symbols represent the interests and the lives of those who died or were wounded. The memorial is also includes symbols representing critical events in Tucson's history, which show the city's resilience and strength in the face of adversity. The memorial design was created in consultation with relatives of the victims as well as survivors. Input was received from the Tohono O'odham Nation, on whose ancestral land the memorial sits. Groups affiliated with the memorial statues located in the Presidio were also consulted. The memorial was funded by donations from individuals, foundations, and companies in Arizona. The events of January 8, 2011 should be remembered as a national tragedy, just as our community's response should be commemorated as a national point of pride. The significance of this event, an attempted assassination of a sitting member of Congress, the first ever death of a congressional staff person in the line of duty, the death of Chief Judge of the Federal Court in Arizona, the death of a beautiful 9-year-old girl, and the death of 3 senior citizens are too important not to memorialize at a national level. Designating the January 8th National Memorial Site as an affiliated area of the Park Service will not only elevate its status to that of national significance, but it will also increase its visibility, hopefully giving others across the country an opportunity to honor the victims, the survivors of this horrific tragedy, and see the strength of our community in its aftermath. We were determined not to let this tragedy define us. What happened after the shooting in this memorial defined the compassion and caring that came to each of us from our community and contributed to our healing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Barber, for your service to our country and for your testimony today. Very compelling. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Holmes Norton for 30 seconds to introduce Ms. Adrena Crockett, founder and program manager of the Georgetown African American Historic Landmark Project and Tour.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to introduce Adrena Crockett to speak on behalf of my bill, HR 4009. She's a Georgetown University alum. Ms. Crockett founded the Georgetown African American Historic Landmark Project and Tour, an organization comprised of local community advocates and historians who are dedicated to researching and memorializing the free and enslaved African American residents who lived and worked in Georgetown. I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Crockett.
Good morning, Chairman, Ranking Member Wasserman, and other distinguished subcommittee members. My name is Adrena Crockett. Thank you for this opportunity to speak before you. HR 4009, the Georgetown Waterfront Enslaved Voyage Memorial Act, would authorize the establishment of a commemorative work in the District of Columbia recognizing the contributions of people of African descent who were brought to American shores against their will and who toiled without recognition or compensation. This commemorating work shall serve as a place of reflection and healing for all Americans. A plaque is not an option to commemorate the 388,747 Americans who survived the voyage to mainland North America, nor the approximate 42 million descendants currently living in the United States. As a sponsor of the bill, I testify to the lasting impact on our nation as we progress towards a more perfect union and the lasting impact on the world as other nations watch and learn. The bill was submitted based on data compiled into the slave trade database hosted by Rice University and after the designation of Georgetown Waterfront as a UNESCO Site of Memory, confronting researchers are records during that period that include Georgetown, Piscataway, Port Tobacco, and smaller Maryland landings, collectively known as North Potomac. During the National Capital Memorials Advisory Commission meeting, a recommendation to amend the bill to propose a national memorial was made. Maps drawn in 1838 show that even then, depths of the Potomac River at the base of Wisconsin were more than enough to, for big ships to travel. Diagrams depict the ship's construction capable of navigating these waters. The 14th Street Bridge was not built until 1808. The memorial is not so much about how the enslaved got here, but their survival. The 1800 U.S. Census records 1,449 enslaved and 277 free African Americans out of a total of 120 when Georgetown officially was a part of Montgomery County, Maryland. As mentioned, we do have Yale University and other scholars conducting research. Unfortunately, many enslaved worked under inhumane conditions, their identity stripped, their last names removed, their religion eliminated, and after the Civil War and emancipation, those freed had their dignity suppressed by Black codes and Jim Crow laws enacted to keep them in servitude. The United States did issue a formal apology, H.R. 194 in 2008. Representative Cohen, Democrat from Tennessee, said only a great country can recognize and admit its mistakes and then travel forth to create indeed a more perfect union. In the apology for the enslavement of African Americans, Senate concurrent Resolution 26 in the 111th Congress on the behalf of the United States citizens acknowledged fundamental injustices, cruelty, and brutal treatment. This apology was primarily symbolic, but a step forward in atoning. The District of Columbia has no physical or natural sites to convert into a memorial to dedicate to commemorate those families who were torn apart. There are memorials and monuments recognizing legacies of the enslaved in different forms around the world. Pelourinho in Brazil, the Ark of Return at the United Nations headquarters in New York, La Citadelle La Ferrière in Haiti. Erecting a memorial sends a positive and powerful message. 158 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, it is befitting that a memorial be erected among the many monuments, memorials, and embassies for all Americans to pause for a moment to erase just one drop of pain. A simple "we acknowledge your existence" can have a profound impact on erasing years of neglect. Indicative of triumph over guilt and shame, flower sellers in the market at Washington, D.C. illustrates in 1870 a blending of cultures, ladies with African head wraps and American style dresses This location is known as the Georgetown Market at 3276 M Street. Once again, I thank you. I thank the committee. I thank Congressman Norton for allowing me this time to speak before you.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. The chair, thank you for your testimony today. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Rodney Ellis, Commissioner on the Commissioners Court of Harris County, Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members who give me a chance to participate. I am Rodney Ellis, and I'm pleased to be with you today. Here we go. I'm here to testify in support of Representative Al Green's legislation, H.R. 4544, the Reconciliation Act, Reconciliation and Place Names Act. Harris County is the third largest county in the country. We have about 4.7 million people. I represent about 1.2 million. It includes parts of Representative Green's district. It is very ethnically and culturally diverse. There are over 1,000 units of federally owned public land that contains some racially offensive term in that title. I have had the opportunity to work on this issue for many years. There are names around this country such as Negro, Red Man, Wetback, Squaw, BITCH, Darky, Chink, Coon, Redskin, Dead Negro, Dead Indian, and various other names. As the committee knows, the United States Board of Geographic Names, BGN, oversees all naming processes and decisions on public land. The board's current administrative process to change names is long drawn out and very cumbersome. At the stroke of a pen years ago, someone was easily able to name a piece of nature an offensive slur that dehumanizes people. Yet today, there's a complicated process to do what ought to be relatively simple. We have to step back and ask ourselves, why is it so hard to change these racist and derogatory names of public land? I've experienced this complicated process firsthand when I was working to change the offensive names in my community. It was a lake that was named Negro Lake. In 1991, over 30 years ago, as a member of the Texas Senate, I co-sponsored legislation to get rid of about 19 racially offensive names on public lands throughout the state of Texas. We were able to pass the legislation in a bipartisan manner. And I found out about a year ago that despite that law passing the Texas House and the Senate and being signed into law by the governor of Texas, the BGN denied changing those names. These applications would need to go through the BGN's time-consuming and complicated application review process, again with additional documentation of local community support. Over the last year, I worked with my former colleagues in the Texas legislature to change these offensive names on public lands in the state of Texas. And we urged the BGN to revise its processes. Finally, in June this year, the BGN approved the applications to change the names of 17 sites in Texas with the word Negro to their current titles. And I commend them for doing that. Across our country, there's still more than 1,000 or so geographic sites that are racially offensive. This federal legislation that I support should do exactly what its title calls for, a Reconciliation in Place Names Act that would streamline the process and make it a lot more palatable. It's an issue that I think is ripe. It's an important issue. I appreciate Congressman Green picking up the mantle, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions, but we'd like to get this done. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you for your testimony. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Escobar from Texas for 30 seconds to introduce Mr. Albert Hernandez, the author of El Paso's Darkest Day.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before introducing our panelists, I'd like to first express my gratitude to you for holding this hearing. On August 3rd, 2019, a domestic terrorist drove nearly 10 hours from Central Texas to a Walmart in El Paso, where he carried out the deadliest targeted attack against Latinos in modern American history. He confessed to wanting to massacre Mexicans and immigrants, parroting racist language used by a past president and still used today by some in positions of power. Our community was devastated, and more than 2 years later, we're still dealing with the trauma, loss, and injustice that was inflicted on our community. County of El Paso, in order to honor and commemorate the 23 innocent lives lost that day, built a beautiful and serene healing garden. I'm grateful to the county for ensuring we never forget, and I'm asking Congress and the President to ensure this place of peace and comfort becomes a national memorial. I'm proud to introduce one of my constituents today, Mr. Albert Hernandez, who was personally affected by the tragedy that struck our community on August 3rd. Mr. Hernandez is a proud graduate of the University of Texas at El Paso in education. He was one of the Texas activists who fought against the Sierra Blanca nuclear waste dump site in our region. He continues to reside in our community of El Paso, Texas, and through his book and continued advocacy, he's become a voice for the fallen at the El Paso massacre at Walmart. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Escobar. The chair recognizes Mr. Hernandez. Oh, and Mr. Hernandez, I believe we see you, but we can't hear you. If you might unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Can you hear me
we
now?
can.
All right, thank you. Good morning. Anyway, I'll briefly introduce myself and my relation to one of the victims there at the Walmart shooting. My name is Albert Hernandez, and I had two relatives that were killed there at the Walmart, massacred. One is Maribel Hernandez, which is my sister, and her husband, Leo. Leo, two wonderful people that perished that day on August 3rd, 2019. I'll give you a brief history of El Paso, just really brief. We are a binational community, a very friendly community. We've always have open arms to all that come to visit our community. We cherish racial diversity. Here in El Paso, we don't have the problems that we have in the northern states where there's a lot of racial tension. But we cherish diversity. We are a community that we were caught off guard that day, and I'll give you a brief what I think happened that day. It brought back a lot of memories of 9/11. We were attacked in the same form or fashion. It was a beautiful sunny day. People were out just shopping at the Walmart, doing their thing. Little did they know that day everything would change. The community would change. We were attacked by what I call, and everybody here in this town knows, is a terrorist. It was a terrorist attack. We didn't think that it would be someone from our state. We thought it was some foreign terrorist coming in. It terrorized the community of El Paso. It was a horrible day. You name it, everything happened that day. It was a chaotic situation. The city was under duress, distraught. We didn't know what was happening. The people running, people panicking, people were just at an awe of what was happening that day. That's why I compare it to 9/11. Also, I don't want to get into the tragedy that happened inside. Everybody knows it was a massacre, basically a massacre that happened that day. People were massacred because of who they are, their racial ethnicity. This evildoer came to our city, specifically targeting El Paso. He wrote it in his confession that he would come here and kill as many Mexicans that he possibly could have. He shot almost 52 people. That's why it's considered the most horrendous crime against the Hispanic community. He did it in an evil way, in a very, very, the best way I can describe it, he was a very evil person, walks in and starts shooting people at random. The people were falling dead. He used a weapon of that only the military should use. You don't stand a chance when you get shot with an AK-47 with the rounds that he was using. You don't stand a chance. It hits you and it just knocks you out. There's video of that, of people just being knocked down with the first shots. My sister got shot twice. He wasn't happy with shooting her once. He shot her twice in the torso. And then my brother-in-law went to go and try to save her and shield her, and he was shot in the head, in the back. I mean, this evildoer came here to create the worst terrorist attack on the nation, not only Hispanics, on the nation. I, as a voice for the Walmart victims, I want to show the world what happened that day. And with the memorial that would go up here in El Paso, I think that it would be a step in the right direction. So we show the people of El Paso, of the country, that El Paso has good people. We're resilient. We came together in a strong way. Never did he try to separate us. We came all together as a one city, and we want to show the world that what is going on in this country with this El Paso Healing Garden. It is something that needs to go down in history, so more generations can see what happened here. You know, these nothing will bring these people back. Nothing's going to bring them back. We understand that. But we need to get something good that would come out of all of this. And we need to let the country show some type of conscience of what's going on with this country, with hatred, and with all this people shoving this, that there's no terrorism. We have domestic terrorists in the country, and we need to address this. We need to show what's going on. We need to do something about this, because it's only going to get worse. That's what's going to happen. It's only going to get worse, and we need to address it. And by us having this memorial, I think that it's going to be a step in the right direction for the healing process of the city of El Paso. And thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your testimony, and our continued condolences to you and your family.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes, rather the chair will go ahead and recognize Mr. Scott Fontenot, the mayor of Eunice, Louisiana, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, distinguished members of this committee. This is my first time testifying, so I apologize if I'm not as on sharp as I should be.
You're doing great so far.
Thank you. So this act, HR 3197, introduced by Representative Mike Johnson, Save the Liberty Act of 2021. You know, this is very important to our city and our region. Just to give you a quick breakdown of what's going on here in the city of Eunice, Louisiana. We're located South Louisiana in Acadiana. We're in a part of the country where our people were exiled from Nova Scotia, you know, nearly 300 years ago, and settled down here in South Louisiana. My father and grandmother both speak French. Unfortunately, I didn't pick up on the language because it was frowned upon in schools. Although I'm doing my best to learn Cajun French again. To the Liberty Theater. The Liberty Theater is a crown jewel in our small community here in Eunice. Our history and heritage have attracted thousands of visitors from all over the world. It adds charm and entices people to make Eunice their home also. We're having people move here because they just love it down here. They love the people, the culture, the cuisine. So Eunice, we already have an established and widely recognized cultural character. And actually the Liberty Theater is deeply rooted into the component of Eunice's Cajun culture and a key player in the continued tourism appeal for our city and South Louisiana. Closing of the theater, we ended up closing our theater back right prior to the pandemic when they restrictions on large gatherings here in our state. But we were also in the process of closing, so it kind of happened in the right timing, should I say. Unfortunately, the national park, we had a memorandum terminated between the city and the national park. And that was just some cost cutting measures on the national park side. We still have a standing relationship with the Park Service. They have been great for the city of Eunice and our region. The people who work for them are great. I do want to thank Representative Mike Johnson. He's personally came down to Eunice multiple times. He shares the vision of what wants to be done here in our city to keep promoting our culture and our tourism. One of the primary goals of revitalizing the theater is to and live downtown. Downtown is going through some major renovation projects. We have a library right across the street we're going to put about $500,000 into. There's a private side, like the Liberty Theater, that's undergoing $1 million renovation project. So we have a lot of things. We entered into a public and private partnership with the Liberty Association, and it's a group of individuals who have banded together to really take control and really push forward the programming and such of the theater. We have just recently been selected, the City of Eunice, by the EPA Technical Assistance Grant Building Blocks Program for Sustainable Communities. We're one of only 3 communities in the United States, and this is for leveraging cultural anchor institutions, and it's focused around the Liberty Theater. One of the main things, the reason why we're asking to get this property into the city is because the annex that was built in the 80s, when the Park Service and the city started their relationship, is the annex contains the only functioning restrooms for the facility and the only ADA compliant accessibility to get into the building. I know there's grant opportunities and such that we are applying for. So we're just asking to please consider this bill, and we look forward to continuing our relationship with the Park Service. And just to let you know, in our town in Eunice, Louisiana, we're a small community of about 10,000 people. Most of them have Cajun French names like mine, Fontenot or Bordeaux or Boudreaux, and all these people. But tourism is a huge economic driver in our community, and without the Liberty really being that showcase, we fail. And I just thank you all for listening and understanding how to get back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We all look forward to visiting Eunice soon. I know Congressman Johnson is here, and I know he wanted to introduce you, Mr. Mayor, and also I'll go ahead and yield to him to introduce Miss Rebecca Blankenbaker, Executive Director of the Cane River National Heritage Area. Mr. Johnson, we can see you, but we're unable to hear you.
There we go. Is that a little better?
That is better.
Gee, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
I appreciated hearing from Mayor Scott Fontenot. I think Mr. Fulcher was actually going to do the formal introduction, and then I was just going to ask a few questions.
Oh, is that right? I'm sorry. Is Mr. Fulcher, are you going to do the introduction of Ms. Blankenbaker?
Mr. Chairman, I
Yes, sir.
am not prepared to do that, so please.
Okay, well, why don't I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll.
Sorry, gentlemen. Sorry.
No, that's all right. That's quite all right. Ms. Blankenbaker is the Executive Director of the Cane River National Heritage Area, and she is recognized for 5 minutes for testimony.
Thanks.
The floor is yours.
Good morning, Chairman Neguse, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Fulcher, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Rebecca Blankenbaker, and I am the Executive Director of Cane River National Heritage Area, a congressionally designated national heritage area and a nonprofit organization that works in partnership with the Cane River Creole National Historical Park to protect, preserve, and promote the tangible and intangible cultural, natural, and historic resources of the Cane River region. Thank you for the opportunity to present testimony in support of H.R. 4648, a bill introduced by our friend, Representative Mike Johnson, to expand the boundary of the Magnolia Plantation Unit of the Cane River Creole National Historical Park in the state of Louisiana. H.R. 4648 would expand the legislative boundary of the Magnolia Plantation Unit of the park from 18 acres to approximately 46.1 acres. The land that would be added to the boundary is part of the historic Magnolia Plantation, which is a National Historic Landmark and is currently owned by the descendants of the original plantation owners. The property includes the main house, 7 outbuildings, and several cultural landscape features and archaeological sites. At present, the National Park Service owns a smaller portion of Magnolia Plantation, maintaining 18 acres with approximately 20 historic structures. In 1994, Congress simultaneously created the Cane River Creole National Historical Park and the Cane River National Heritage Area, the only instance of an NPS unit and a National Heritage Area being co-legislated to protect and preserve a region's cultural resources and heritage. The legislation recognized the importance of the Cane River Creole culture as a nationally significant element of the cultural heritage of the United States, and determined a partnership approach would best serve the preservation needs of the area, ensuring the vital need for cultural sensitivity and emphasizing local private-public partnerships. Located in northwestern Louisiana, along the banks of the Cane River in Natchitoches Parish, the Cane River Creole National Historical Park preserves the distinctive architecture and cultural landscapes of the only 2 intact Creole cotton plantations in the United States, and interprets the mix of cultures whose long and complex history began with Native American trade, early 18th century European exploration, and settlement in Louisiana's first Creole colony. The park celebrates the resulting cultural interaction and interdependence among Native American, French, Spanish, and Africans, as well as the subsequent development and evolution of Creole culture and plantation life along Cane River. At the height of its operation, Magnolia Plantation was the largest plantation in Natchitoches Parish, both in terms of land and in terms of enslaved peoples. It has direct connections to African American history from the late 1700s to the 1970s, from the period of enslavement to the Civil War, and from Reconstruction to sharecropping and tenant farming of the mid-20th century. Many of the enslaved individuals who lived at the plantation were responsible for the construction and continued development of Magnolia's vernacular architecture, agricultural landscapes, and material culture. Their legacy can be seen throughout the park, from handmade tools used for heavy labor held in the museum's collection to the surviving brick slave and tenant quarters standing as a testament of the adversities they faced. During the establishment of the park in 1994, the Magnolia Plantation Corps was divided. Half was acquired by the National Park Service, and the other half remained in private ownership. However, at the time, it was noted that important plantation resources existed outside the current park boundary. H.R. 4648 would allow the National Park Service to acquire and preserve the privately owned half of the historic plantation core, fulfilling the park's mission to protect Magnolia Plantation in its entirety. From an economic perspective, the Cane River Creole National Historical Park is a vital component of the Cane River National Heritage Area and the Natchitoches region's heritage tourism and travel economy. Annual park visitors spend an estimated $1.8 million in the local Gateway region, which supports our small businesses, restaurants, and members of our cultural economy. Enlargement of the park to include the entire Magnolia Plantation core is welcomed as an opportunity to present this important place as a whole, and is supported locally among our city, parish, and state officials, as well as the landowners and descendants of the plantation's traditionally associated people. In closing, extending the Magnolia Plantation unit boundary will ensure that the region's nationally significant cultural resources are preserved and interpreted and is crucial to sustaining this unique place. Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I would be happy to answer any questions you or other members may have.
Well, thank you, Ms. Blankenbaker, for your testimony today. The gentlewoman yields back, and the chair will now recognize our final witness, Mr. William Shafroth, who is a dear friend and a Coloradan, and the president and CEO of the National Park Foundation. Mr. Shafroth, you are recognized. Oh, we may have lost Mr. Shafroth. Madam Clerk, do you have Mr. Shafroth with us?
I see him on the platform.
Yes, I am. I'm here. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. How are you today?
Yes, we can see you. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
I apologize. I'm having a classic COVID moment in that the tree service has just decided to park in front of my house and do some wood chipping and chainsawing. And so I've been now trying to convince them to stop it for a few minutes while I'm testifying, but we'll just bear with me if it's a little loud. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Fulcher, members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for inviting me today. On behalf of all who love America's national parks, I truly appreciate the opportunity to testify today. My name is Will Shafroth, and I'm President and CEO of the National Park Foundation, the official philanthropic partner of the National Park Service. The foundation was chartered in 1967 and was founded on a legacy that began more than a century ago when private citizens from all walks of life acted to establish and protect our national parks. Today, the National Park Foundation carries on that tradition as the only national charitable nonprofit whose sole mission is to directly support the National Park Service. Working together with the Park Service and a dedicated community of people and organizations who champion the cause of our parks, the foundation strives to preserve and restore these great places and to ensure that all people are able to discover their own personal connections to national parks. In fiscal year 20, a time of unprecedented challenge, we'll all agree that the foundation contributed more than $76 million to the parks, answering the call to those who sought refuge in the outdoors, all while expanding our work in historical and cultural resource preservation. I'm pleased to report that the foundation's on track to grow its impact in parks even greater in fiscal 21, providing more support for programs like Service Corps and Open Outdoors for Kids, as well as investing in a number of African American and Latino heritage projects. Today, the subcommittee is reviewing a total of 9 bills, all of which in their own way would, if enacted, provide a fuller story of our uniquely American history. The National Park Foundation defers to the Park Service and the Interior Department on the merits of these bills, but we do support telling the stories of all Americans, which can have an effect of making parks relevant to people who haven't found their connection to these places. As we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, I thought I'd highlight the work the foundation does to better tell the stories of the contributions of Latinos and Hispanics throughout our nation's history. We do this work through something called the Latino Heritage Fund. It was established back in 2011. The fund works to preserve Latino history, stories, and contributions to the United States, both past and present, through our national parks. With support of its donors, the foundation works in collaboration with the Park Service and other partners to preserve and share stories that commemorate Hispanic heritage in parks and communities across the country. This includes working with the NPS to identify innovative ways to expand engagement of members of the Latino community in our parks and make our parks more relevant and accessible to all people. Some of the specific work that we've done through our fund includes funding the initial theme study around American Latinos in the making of the United States. This theme study provided Park Service with an analysis of the significant people, places, and events in Latino history. And due in part to the theme study research, 11 Latino heritage history sites have been designated as new National Historic Landmarks. The Park Foundation also helped to stand up the Cesar Chavez National Monument as a unit of the park system, which commemorates the home and final resting place of Cesar Chavez. The foundation occasionally provides this kind of initial financial support to a new park unit at the request of the Park Service to accelerate the ability for the park to be ready to receive visitors and to create a great visitor experience. We've done that in other places in the system, including Pullman, Stonewall, and Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monuments. The foundation is also supporting a youth summit for Latino students and teachers by engaging them in historic preservation projects within their communities. And finally, one of my most favorite current things we're doing is the foundation supporting 4 cultural landscape apprentice positions for Hispanic and Latino young adults at San Antonio Missions National Historic Park in Texas. The key aspect of the work involves preserving the historic acequias, or these are irrigation canals that existed hundreds of years ago. National parks are a uniquely American idea, with places that are truly supported all Americans. And to me, there really are our common ground as a nation. With the national park system now in its second century, the foundation is committed to continuing its work with NPS to tell the stories of all Americans. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts and look forward to continue to work with the committee, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shafroth, for your testimony, and as always, for indulging us with your time here. Committee. I want to remind members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D, imposes a 5-minute limit on questions, and the chair will now recognize members for any questions that they may wish to ask the witnesses. And I'd like to start by recognizing Ranking Member Fulcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll go straight to Mr. Shafroth since he's just finishing up. But Mr. Shafroth, I thought it was incredible. The Park Foundation raised over $76 million last year to support our national parks. And I'm interested in further incentivizing private donations to our parks and public-private partnerships that improve our parks and save taxpayer money. Do you have any suggestions this committee may look at to further facilitate private sector support of our parks?
Mr. Fulcher, that's a very good question. I can tell you that in 2021, when Congress provided a 100% deduction for donations during that year of COVID, we did see an uptick in ours and our partners' contributions at the local level. I don't know that that's something that Congress wants to repeat. That's something that's presently on our mind because we did see an uptick in contributions. I think that some of this is also just creating an efficient relationship between the Park Service and the many organizations. There are 450 groups that work full or part-time on behalf of our national parks on a day-to-day basis. And the degree to which we can find ways to allow those organizations to be even more effective in their relationship with the Park Service is going to have the practical effect of increasing the ability for donors to go and give more money. And part of this, Mr. Fulcher, is that just there's an efficiency here. We can, if we raise $100,000 to support Park X, we need to make sure that the Park Service has the capacity to receive those dollars and put those programs or projects in place. And so that's all I'd say is that it's a systemic solution that we need to look at here. There isn't sort of a magic bullet, I want to tell you.
Thank you, Mr. Shafroth. Appreciate it. With limited time, I'd like to know, Mr. Chairman, is Mayor Fontenot still with us? I'd like to add a question or two for him. Mayor Fontenot?
Great question. Madam Clerk, can you hold the timer? We'll let you go a little over, Ranking Member. Is the mayor still with us, Madam Clerk?
Yes.
Great, he is.
The Liberty Theater is a key player in promoting tourism to the city of Eunice. How will the Save the Liberty Theater Act help revitalize your downtown area and help surrounding small businesses? Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I know you touched on it, but if you could elaborate just a little bit, that could be helpful.
So when the theater was in operating condition, and also want to add that the portion of the property that we're asking for, there's an HVAC system that sits on that property, and the HVAC system failed, and it needs to be replaced. And we're having some issues right now with the interior on mold and such. But whenever the theater was open, every Saturday night we're having a live radio show, Cajun French music radio show that was broadcast all over the world. And people would come from all over. You had tour buses come from Texas or anywhere from around the area. I live right down the same road, Park Avenue, that the Liberty sits on. And every day I'd pass by, you'd have cars from states that you would never really see a Washington license plate, like Washington State or Idaho or New York State. People come from all over. So it was thriving, and it was very helpful to our downtown and our Main Street area. And not only that, but just to all the local restaurants, the hotels, campgrounds, everything is full when that show is going, especially on a Saturday night, because we don't really have much of a draw to our area. Now, everybody, you've probably ate Cajun food before, but you really never ate it till you came down here. So, or listened to the French and Cajun music, and you might not know what they're singing, but man, you want to tap your feet and dance. So it's something that's so unique, and like our Mardi Gras that we do, everybody thinks of Mardi Gras, you think of New Orleans and beads and parades and floats and all that. Well, we have a more traditional Mardi Gras that we do down here, and it draws people from all over the world. Anthony Bourdain, everybody knows him. He done a show here. He was, so it's something that's a unique draw. And I think the last big show we had was in Mardi Gras was 2020, right before the pandemic really just hit us in the face. The building was filled with 500 people, just having a really good time and just enjoying our history and heritage. And most of those people, let me tell you, I went in the building, I didn't recognize hardly anybody in there, and I know everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've used my time. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ranking member yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Talib for 5 minutes. If there's any questions. Hearing none, the chair now recognizes Vice Ranking Member Tiffany, if he is on. The chair will then proceed to to Chairman Grijalva, if he has any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, once again, I can't thank you enough for this hearing. We've been doing, this committee's been doing a lot of important work and a lot of long markups. And in the process, I want to thank you and the other subcommittees for continuing to do what we're supposed to do, and that is to legislate and to move pieces of legislation. And these are particularly packaged and very significant, and I want to thank you for that. Before, let me just take a minute to talk about Representative Kirkpatrick's bill related to Tucson's January 8th memorial. As with, and then I'll ask my friend Ron and colleague Ron Barber for a couple of questions. But just as with Representative Escobar's legislation, that's also under consideration, this bill, along with that, I wish we didn't even, it didn't exist, that we didn't have to take the time to memorialize. Unfortunately, January 8th, 2011 is a day that Tucsonans and the nation is never going to forget. It's a day that a gunman opened fire at Congresswoman Gifford's Congress on your corner. Events that she would hold to talk with and interact with her constituents, right there in the heart of our community in Tucson. And it wasn't even a random attack, if you think about it. This was an attack on civility. It was on our sense of security and the shared right that we all have to interact with our elected officials, this democracy of ours. And we're fortunate that former colleague, Congressman Ron Barber, survived the shooting. And we're honored that he's here today to discuss the importance and the significance of this memorial, not just to Tucson, but as he said in his testimony, to the impact that it has across the country. Ron, Mr. Barber, excuse me. Can you briefly describe the impact that a national memorial designation would hold for community members, the survivors, and the families and friends and loved ones of the victims? That's part of the question. In the context that the National Park Service testified that we should defer action until the agency has more time to study the national significance of the site and evaluate the best management options. I would assume that's an approach you don't support. Talk about that and also talk about the impact, if you don't mind. And thank you again. And Mr. Barber?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Neguse, ranking member, and committee members. I'll talk about the day and what it meant to us and what it means, I think, to the nation after I respond to your second question, Mr. Chairman, and that is the comment by the National Park Service that they wanted to defer this. I respectfully disagree. I think that when you look at what happened that day, it has national and international significance. I mean, when that shooting took place, it didn't just affect the conscience of our whole community, but it affected the conscience of our whole country and abroad. We had media from everywhere because of the significance of that terrible day. What I would say about why we should have it as a national memorial, I'll comment first of all on what actually happened. I was standing right next to Congresswoman Giffords when the gunman approached her, shot her in the head, turned the gun on me, shot me twice, turned the gun on Chief Judge John Roll and killed him, turned the gun on my deputy, Gabe Zimmerman, and killed him. And what I remember from that day was the horrific impact that it had immediately on our community and for many more years after. The community responded by erecting 3 temporary memorials, one at the Congresswoman's office, one at the shooting site, and one at the hospital where most of us are being treated. Literally hundreds and hundreds of people came every single day to pray, to reflect, to bring candles and poems and all kinds. We had mariachis coming. It was a show of support and compassion unlike anything I've ever seen before. So when you think about the national significance, this is the first time that I know that a member of Congress has been attacked in an assassination attempt. It's the first time that a staff member of Congress was killed. It's the first time that the Chief Justice of the federal court was killed, and all the rest. So if that's not enough for national significance, I don't know what is. It affected us here, it affected the country at large, and I think it's important to have a place where people can come, reflect, meditate, pray, and reflect on what happened that day. And that's, I believe, what will happen. We know that hundreds of people from out of state are already coming. The memorial is open, and it's a main path to the historic courthouse. It's seen every single day by hundreds of city and county and other governmental workers, but it also is seen by thousands so far of our community. I beg to differ with the National Park Service. I think we have enough information at hand to make this a memorial of national significance. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barber, and I yield back, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Barber. The chair will now recognize, let's see if he's on here, Mr. Gomert. Has Mr. Tiffany returned? Hearing none, and Mr. Gomert is not here. Ms. Holmes Norton. Hearing none, go to Mr. Lamborn.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I do have a
You are
question
recognized.
for Ms. Thank you. I have a question for Ms. Crockett. The National Capitol, Ms. Crockett, is she? Yeah, I see her, I think. The National Capitol
Yes, she is here.
Memorial
You can proceed.
The National Capital Memorial Advisory Commission unanimously voted to support H.R. 4009. Furthermore, they recommended to broaden the bill's scope to recognize all enslaved persons who were forcibly migrated through the Middle Passage, as opposed to those who may have disembarked at the Georgetown waterfront. Would you consider supporting broadening the language of H.R. 4009 to honor all enslaved people who came to the United States by way of the transatlantic slave trade?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for your question. As I mentioned to the National Park Service, certainly. I think all should be memorialized and have a place to go to reflect, to reconcile, to heal.
Thank you, Ms. Crockett, for that answer. I will see to it that as they are all memorialized, Georgetown is not left out, but is still central as you have proposed. In addition, could you please tell us more about your inspiration for a memorial honoring enslaved persons who disembarked here in the nation's capital?
As I mentioned in my testimony, in the slave trade database, they mentioned or included North Potomac, which includes Georgetown University. And based on Georgetown, based on that data, Georgetown waterfront was designated as a UNESCO site of memory by the United Nations, who has submitted testimony and has been supportive throughout this project and will continue to be supportive throughout this project.
Thank you. Finally, could you speak to the importance and the need for this memorial in the nation's capital in particular?
Congresswoman, I think it's the least that we can do to recognize those who have given so much for the descendants who have suffered and continue to suffer the trauma of slavery. I think it's the least that the United States can do is to say, we recognize your pain, we recognize you, we know that you existed, instead of just brushing over and trying to forget.
Thank you, Ms. Crockett, for your work. And I will do all I can to see that this memorial is appropriately remembered. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really appreciate the hearing and thanks for everybody's time. And had a couple questions for Mayor Fontenot and just want to say it's great to see you by video, my friend, and you've been an exceptional witness today. We've had several discussions about the Liberty Theater, you and I, of course, and its importance to Eunice and the surrounding community and the culture really of all South Louisiana as a whole. And of course, we love those distinctive Cajun names, my friend. We love Fontenot and Boudreaux and Thibodeau and all the rest. And America loves Cajun culture, and you're right that everywhere I go, there's some kind of Cajun meal on the cuisine on the menu everywhere. And I was in New Hampshire several months back and walked into a diner and they said Cajun spiced sandwich. And I thought, come on, you got to give me a break, you know. What you all export to the world is this rich culture that is appreciated everywhere. And I was wondering if you could just take a minute or two, just share a bit more today about specifically what makes the Liberty Theater so special and why it is so central to the preservation of this rich Cajun culture.
Liberty is pretty much like a temple of Asian music, and a lot of musicians and such get their start there. People recognize the city of Eunice just by the Liberty Theater itself. I know that me personally, I'm a lifelong resident of Eunice. I've traveled all over. My mom is originally from Colorado Springs, and my grandparents, and they moved down when my dad met my mom from the service, and they moved down to Eunice, and they made their home here. And I actually live in my grandparents' house, which is right down the road. So to me, just being Cajun, we're proud of who we are. And if you've seen, we've had these disasters and these hurricanes, and the Cajun Navy comes out. It's a group of people. It's everybody who lives down here in South Louisiana. They get together and they really just support one another. Liberty is so unique, and when you walk into the facility, you are just taken away by its beauty and its history. I know Representative Johnson, when you came down, and you've been here multiple times, and we thank you so much. It's just a unique place. I can tell you, you made the comment on New Hampshire had Cajun sandwich. Well, I was at the state fair in Minnesota, and they had Cajun fries, and I asked them for some, or no, it was a Cajun burger, and they sprinkled some seasoning on it, and so that was the Cajun burger. But no, people typically, if they've never been here, they just don't understand. And I welcome anybody who's on this committee to come down, and I personally invite you to come down to a live show at the Liberty Theater in Eunice. And heck, you can come down and stay at my house if you need a place to stay.
That's
It's
Cajun hospitality. Hey, Mr. Mayor, you heard Chairman Nagus say everybody looks forward to visiting Eunice sometime soon. So I may take my friend up on that, bring him down there, show him some real culture.
Yeah.
So, look, I just want to say you did a great job today. I think if we get this bill signed into law, the city of Eunice takes full ownership interest in the theater and the annex. As we said, I think it really changes the odds of success of delivering on some of that restoration work that's required, and it'll be a great thing for Louisiana, the region, and the whole country. Real quick, Ms. Blankenbaker, thank you also for being on with us from the beautiful city of Natchitoches. And we've been talking about the importance of the Cane River Creole National Historic Park. What are some of those enhanced benefits that would come if HR 4648 is passed and signed into law?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. So the Cane River Creole National Historical Park and the Cane River National Heritage Area share a very unique partnership. Being the private entity that partners with the park will allow us to assist the park in long-term preservation planning and simplify the interpretation efforts. So for HR 4648 will allow, through donation, will expand the park boundaries, but will allow us to utilize our working cooperative endeavor agreement with the National Park Service, and will allow us to also seek private funding to support the preservation and long-term planning of the park.
Thank you for that. And I know we have everybody, state, local leaders, various organizations. Let me name some that are with us. The Sabine Parish Tourist Commission, the City of Natchitoches Planning and Zoning Department, Natchitoches Historic Commission, Louisiana Trust for Historic Preservation. I got 18 seconds left, but I just want to say everybody's in favor of this down here. We really need to do it, and I'm really, really grateful for your leadership and your time. Mr. Chairman, we do want to bring you to Louisiana, and all the members of the committee, if y'all can find the time, I promise you it would enrich your lives and you'd see some really beautiful part of the country you may have never experienced before. Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I yield back.
Sounds like a great field hearing, so I will take that under advisement, and I appreciate the kind offer from you and the mayor. The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize, I believe, Ms. Tlaib for 5 minutes if she has any questions. Hearing none, we'll do a final last call for any members on either side of the dais who might have any questions for our witnesses today. All right, hearing none. Let me first just say thank you again to the witnesses for their valuable testimony
So
today.
sorry, Chairman, can I ask my question? I'm so sorry.
Yes, by all means.
I apologize, everyone.
No worries. That's all right. Ms. Tlaib
Yeah.
is recognized.
I'm multitasking this morning, but I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the representatives and witnesses today. But I do want to speak about HR 4009 in particular, because it reminds me of a special monument in Detroit. I want, everyone to know, 20 years ago, the Gateway to Freedom Monument was unveiled in Hart Plaza on Detroit's riverfront. It was designed to build, as a memorial in an important role that Detroit played as a final stop on the Underground Railroad before enslaved Black folks crossed the Detroit River to freedom in Canada. And a corresponding monument on the Canadian side of the river makes this an international tribute, Chairman, to the struggle for freedom and civil rights for our Black neighbors in America. I'm thankful to Detroit River Project and Kimberly Simmons in my community for raising awareness about this critical monument and working towards establishing a World Heritage Site designated for the Detroit River Freedom Corridor. So Ms. Crockett, I have a question for you really quickly. I want to thank you so much for your work and what you're doing in Georgetown to come, to really memorialize the horrors of the slave trade and to create a monument that will serve as a place of reflection and healing. Can you tell us, because I really want to learn, because I want to get us to a point like this in Detroit. I mean, can you tell us what you hope people feel when they do visit this monument in the future?
Thank you, Congressional Member. I want to just let you know, I only had 5 minutes, so I left out Ontario Windsor's memorial. Um, I think we all, and this is all Americans, need a place to reconcile, to memorialize, to heal, to reflect as we move forward towards a more perfect union. I think a monument would send that message that you can come there and just, as I mentioned, erase just one drop of pain, just one drop of neglect. Collectively, I do appreciate the apology by Congress in 2008. We do recognize the House's apology, but we need to move forward. And as we move forward, this memorial to me and to our committee will symbolize a place where everybody can go and start the conversation of reconciliation.
No, I thank you so much. That's all I think for me, as we, again, I grew up in this beautiful, amazing city, and I think learning about some of the horrors of our history has actually made me a stronger advocate for so many of my Americans that continue to struggle with structural racism and so much more. So I just want to thank you, Ms. Crockett, for bringing this forward, and thank my good colleague for offering this bill. And of course, thank you to all my other colleagues and what they are trying to do with their bills. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Tlaib. The gentlewoman yields back. Let me again thank her and all of the members who participated in today's hearing for their thoughtful questions, insightful questions. Certainly to the members who introduced the pieces of legislation that we considered today. We appreciate their leadership. And again, I want to say thank you to the witnesses for their valuable testimony. We've got such a great group of folks from really all across the country who testified. I know many of you had never testified before the United States Congress before today, and certainly want to assure you that you all did a masterful job, and we welcome you back again sometime soon. But we appreciate your leadership and your willingness to step forward in this civic duty that is testifying before the Congress on these important pieces of legislation. And I also want to say thank you to the ranking member, as well as the chairman and the ranking member of the full committee. This subcommittee is, dare I say, probably one of the more prolific subcommittees of the United States Congress, because we consider so many pieces of legislation, including the 9 bills that we considered today. And it is wonderful to be able to see those pieces of legislation reflect the rich diversity of our country. So again, my gratitude to the ranking member Fulcher, for his cooperation as we pull together these legislative hearings. And of course, I know we have many more before the new year begins. So the members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll certainly ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, subparagraph O, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. So with that being said, if there is no further business